Okay, welcome back, everyone. I know that it is a packed room and there may not be enough seats. Maybe this is what happens when you offer free lunch or when you get the current governor of California to speak. So I think that has a bit to do with it. And please, if you can't find a seat and you need one, I will be happy to personally ask one of my advisees to get up and move so you can find a seat. So just let me know as I get down here and we'll be sure to do that. It's really a tremendous honor for me to introduce our next speaker, Governor Jerry Brown, as well as our moderator and my advisee here in the economics department, Olivia Martin. First, let me just say a few words about Governor Brown, and I obviously can't do justice to his incredible career, which spans 4 decades of public service, Secretary of State in 1970, elected his first term as governor in 74, again in 1978, decided against rerunning in 1982, did a few things over the subsequent years, and was in 1998 elected the mayor of Oakland. He helped to revitalize the city's downtown and to reduce crime, and also founded 2 charter schools. In he was also elected California's Attorney General and then moved back into the governor's office for a 3rd term that started in 2011. He won his 4th and final term 4 years later, and now we're all eager to see what he's going to do in the months and years ahead. Governor Brown has helped to eliminate the state's multi-billion-dollar budget deficit, spearheading successful campaigns to provide billions in new funding for California schools and establish a robust rainy day fund that we learned a lot about this morning to prepare for the next economic downturn. Under Governor Brown, California has cut its unemployment rate in half, expanded health coverage to millions more Californians, and added nearly 3 million new jobs while enacting sweeping public safety, immigration, workers' compensation, water, pension, education, housing, and economic development reforms. He's also spearheaded nation-leading efforts to protect the environment, fight climate change by reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and generating more electricity from renewable sources. Joining Governor Brown here today is Olivia Martin. Olivia is a senior here at Stanford studying economics. As I said, I am delighted to be her advisor, and she is the chair of something called Stanford in Government, which is the largest politics and policy student group on campus, and our co-sponsor for today's event. SIG's mission is to create a culture of civic and political engagement on campus, and Olivia really embodies that, and so do many of her fellow SIG members. She's really passionate about California politics, using data to inform evidence-based policymaking, to increase youth civic engagement, and increase economic opportunity here in California, her home state, and all across the country. She's had an impressive career in public service as well, spending time at California's Department of Education, recently at the USA Facts Institute as well. And Olivia is a former student of mine and a former teaching assistant of mine, and it's been a pleasure to work with her. So when I thought today about who could do the absolute best job on the planet, I thought to myself, Olivia Martin. And so please join me in welcoming Governor Brown and Olivia Martin for our next session.
Well, okay, I've been asked to say a few words. Most of this, I hope, will come out in the question and answers. I would just frame this question, what's next for California, by looking back, what has been California? And that may be a product of being older than I was when I started. So when you're 80, you have a lot more to look back to than you have to look forward to, at least in a quantitative sense. And so I've been paying more attention to California history. The only California history I had up until a few years ago was what I got in the 4th grade in public school, and that's interesting. But to understand the dynamic of California, it is well to look at the big sweep. And if you look back from the first inhabitants to the state, people came here certainly 12,000 years ago, and there's archaeological evidence that they came 20,000, and even some claim as far back as 30,000. But anyway, we know there were settlements, thousands up and down California. But the point I would make is that for thousands of years, California contained a population of about 300,000. That was it. It was pretty steady as far as, pretty stable as far as I can tell. Well, flash forward, we're now at 40 million. Now, is 40 million the right number? Or is it closer to 300,000? Or could we take it up to 60 million? Our finance people think we can get to 50 million. But certainly, there's certainly a carrying capacity and a right number for people and how they live. So if we're gonna have more people, we're certainly gonna have to live much differently than when there were fewer people. And I think that's part of our challenge here. When they talk about housing or poverty or transportation or pollution or greenhouse gases, this is all a function of a state that wants to have 40 million and then 300,000. We don't know quite what the problems were. They didn't leave a lot of writing. But I think it's also something to think about, that the stability over thousands of years can, in a matter of a few decades, radically change. Because with the coming of the Spanish, 1769, it wasn't but a few years till half the native people were wiped out. And then when the gold rush came, a few decades later, 1848, then the other half were wiped out, so there was only about 10% of the native people. The reason I bring that up is that we feel we're very stable here, because the modern California started in 1850. Boy, it'll go on forever. But we have examples where things all of a sudden radically shift. And our way of life can radically shift too. Under climate change, certainly if we had a nuclear encounter of some kind, or perhaps with the climate changing, the disease, habitat destruction, who knows? We don't know exactly how stable things are. It looks good on the Stanford campus, but I think we have to keep our eye open to potential game changers. So we like to be exuberant, and I'm very exuberant on California and America and the world, but there are factors that could pull the whole thing down. And as humankind develops more and more power, tools, technology that can do so many amazing things, part of those amazing things are complete annihilation and destruction. So we've got to, yeah, I mean, that's true. I mean, you put 100 nuclear bombs, we'll send 100, Russia sends 100, and that'll pretty well be the end of the story. And the only thing that's keeping it is our good sense, the calm wisdom of our president, and the calm wisdom of Mr. Putin, and the Mr. Modi over in India, the leader of Pakistan. So those are, the fact that you just laugh, I'm glad. So you're feeling a little uncomfortable. And that really would be the point here. You have to keep in mind the tremendous possibilities and the dynamism of our contemporary culture and our being here in California. But on the other hand, there's some big downsides that might well happen. In fact, maybe there's more probability they will than they won't. So that's why I like to kind of look back and see what happens, and I keep learning new things. I once quoted in one of my State of the State speeches our first governor, Peter Burnett, because I thought he made a good quote about having to have challenges to bring forth strong character. He talked about the counteracting cause that brought out the best in people. And I thought that was a great quote. Then, and more recently, I've read more into Peter Burnett, and I learned in his second speech to the California legislature, he called for the annihilation of the native peoples, and also said that African-American people should not come to California because they will be discriminated against, and that will cause a lot of discontent. So I didn't know that when I quoted his first speech. So you can learn a lot. And what I learned, of course, is things keep changing, and they're going to keep changing now. The world looks very different. Politics is very different. I can still remember my father ran for Attorney General. There was no television in the campaigns. he ran for district attorney. I was old enough to see and watch those campaigns. So the evolution from a campaign based on newspapers and fraternal organizations and unions and various ethnic fraternities of one kind or another, now we're all onto big data, targeting, micro kind of focus on different segments. So there's not really people anymore. There are demographic units that are studied and then messaged to try to get them to respond. So it's a very different environment. I think it's less stable. Things are speeding up and the changes are very rapid. So and I look back, not as far, but when I first started, the gross domestic product of California was about $2 trillion. Now it's approaching $2.8 trillion. So that means in the time that I've been governor, this year we have $800 billion more than we had when I started. Now that ought to make you feel pretty good. And I think of this, that I had nothing to do with this, but it sure makes people feel a lot better about me. So I think that's worth reflecting on. There are a lot of external factors beyond one's control, whether it's you personally or a student or a professor or a governor. And there are some things you can control or you can control a bit. So that's the challenge here, to understand what we can affect, what we can change, what we can manage, and what we can't. And how do we do that? So we've been doing a lot of things in California. One of the most obvious, the Californians have. Californians now have about 32 million vehicles. Those 32 million vehicles go about 340 billion miles every year. That's the vehicle miles traveled. They use 18 billion gallons of gasoline and diesel, 18 billion. I've set a goal that by 2030, we'll use half that. Now, don't ask me how we're going to do that. But we are going to do it. And Stanford is going to produce a lot of the battery technology to make that possible. So we're counting on scientists and entrepreneurs to make that a reality. We're also introducing regulations, vehicle standards, and other kinds of things in our whole climate action program. So there's a lot of effort going on to deal with this problem of all this gasoline and diesel going up into the form of greenhouse gases. So that's been a major problem. We're also dealing with our prison system. The prisons during the time of Reagan and my father and my first term had between 20 and 30,000 inmates. By the time Schwarzenegger shows up, it got to 173,000. And then the state was sued and it went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. And by a 5-4 vote, the 4 liberal members plus Kennedy said the California prison system was overcrowded and they had to take action immediately to reduce capacity or increase capacity. So as it turned out, that put us on a pathway, and we now have 128,000. And we've introduced a number of programs to find other ways of dealing with crime and punishment. So that's been a major shift, but a major shift that was stimulated and really pushed by one vote of the United States Supreme Court. Had that not happened, we'd still be with such crowded prisons that there couldn't be any rehabilitation, you couldn't have programming, you couldn't have drug treatment to speak of, or even any mental health treatment. So I just mentioned the prisons, the climate change, the transportation sector. These are key challenges, and we're responding. But the we is business, it's politicians, it's federal judges, and other players in this big system that we call our modern society. So when you look at it, we tend to, if you look at the news, the president gets the most news. And that's just a convention. There's no reason that has to be, but all the newspapers and all the media, the fake media and the true media, all got together and they said, the biggest story is whatever the president does today. So if he tweets, that's a bigger story than a climate disaster somewhere. These are some of the external factors that we have to deal with. So I think I'll just leave it there. There are a lot of topics to go into. Just recognizing there's a lot of players and a lot of factors that are in our control somewhat and out of our control quite a lot.
Thank you, Governor Brown. And thank you for joining us on behalf of Stanford and government. It's an honor to have you. I just wanted to make an announcement about note cards. I think hopefully most of you have found note cards on your seat. We'll be collecting questions from your note cards around 12:30, and I'll start asking a few of these questions from the note cards around 12:45. So I just wanted to keep that in mind. So what's next for California? Today is Friday, November 2nd, just 4 days before a major election, and you've seen a lot of major elections in your time. I'd like to start with your first elections. You were first elected as a member of the Los Angeles Community College District Board of Trustees, and your first statewide election was just 1 year later in 1970 when you were elected as Secretary of State for California, the office that now oversees California's elections. So why did you first decide to run for elected office, and why for these offices?
Well, I suppose, why? The why goes back to many, many factors. But I was sitting once in the governor's mansion around the 60s. My father was governor, and I think he was 65, and I was studying for the bar exam. And he was having a meeting with the Speaker of the Assembly, and it got very heated. And they were debating who should be the leader and run for governor in the next election. And I had been spending several hours with my head buried in these law books, which is very, very soporific experience. Here, the encounter of these two men talking about politics in California, I found that from being somewhat sleepy and from all this studying for the bar, all of a sudden my heart started beating, it started pounding, got very excited. I said, I think this is what I want to do. I want to run for governor. So I decided that in 1965. So that's how I turned out. I moved to LA because LA's got more voters than San Francisco. That's true. And, if you get on television in San Francisco, in LA, you're talking to 55% of Californians. If you get on the TV in the Bay Area, it's somewhat like 25%. So it's twice the value, the same cost. So then I ran for I heard about the junior college board, so I ran for it. And you say, why? This is what you do. My father told me that politics, running for office, is like being a racehorse. Once you hear the gun go off, you just start going till the election stops you. Then you don't ask why, you just start running. And that's literally, I've been doing that quite a bit for the last several decades. But I ran for the junior college board. There were 124 candidates. Luckily, in a practice that was subsequently changed, the candidates were listed alphabetically. So Brown was right up there. And also because it was 1969, my father had been governor for 8 years, leaving the office in 67. So I came in first with 124 candidates. And that was the most exciting election for me, because it was the first one. And to go from observer of your father's electoral activity to actually winning on one's own, that was very exciting to me. So modest. But that was not enough. I wasn't going to stop at the junior college board. So there was another office called Secretary of State, and I'd always read the voter pamphlet. I was always interested in politics, and my father has been running for office. He started running, actually his first real campaign was 1939. I was born in 1938, and he ran every 4 or 2 years until he was defeated in 1966. So I used to look at the voter pamphlet, and they always had a guy named Frank Jordan. He was the Secretary of State. He and his father held that office for 50 years. I always said, Secretary of State. Now that sounds like what is the Secretary of State? That sounds important. So it turned out that, because a lot of this is tactics, you got to understand You can't just decide you want something. You have to have the terrain on which to work. At that time, what happened was he actually died, and that was very helpful because there was not an incumbent. So anyway, I wanted to run for Secretary of State because I thought I could get there. I thought with my father's name and Secretary of State occupation under that name, I said that'd be a hell of I could get to be governor doing that. Edmund G. Brown Jr., Secretary of State of the state of California. Anyway, so I did that. And I was the only Democrat elected, which is a very interesting point there where, we're all in it together. But the fact that no other Democrats were on the ballot to compete with me 4 years later was not unnoticed. So 4 years later I ran. And I like the excitement of it. I like the intellectual challenge. And I like the interaction of so many competing points of view. All these issues, whether they're crime, taxes, pollution, they're complicated and they're living issues, and you have people with different points of view. And so to be in the middle of all that, I find it's extremely creative, stimulating, it's very demanding. And it can bring out of your thinking a lot more than I find that the interaction, the combat, the debate is more productive of new ideas and new initiatives than just sitting and thinking something up without that kind of interaction. And politics is all about interaction. And if you're a governor, you have two parties, you've got 120 legislators, you have all the different departments, and then you have all the newspapers, and everybody telling you what to do or not to do. So it's a maelstrom of interesting and conflicting ideas. So certain kind of people are drawn to that, and I'm one of those people.
Thank you for that. One of the issues you brought up in your opening remarks and just then was sort of this issue of crime. And this is an issue I think that's on a lot of students' minds at Stanford. And you've dedicated a lot of time and effort to the criminal justice system in each of your terms in office. So in many ways, California has led the country with much lower incarceration rates, with new initiatives like Prop 47 and Prop 57, trying to improve rehabilitation in the criminal justice system. Yet while we have much lower incarceration rates than the US on average, as you mentioned before, our incarceration rate has increased a lot since the 70s, a lot during Governor Schwarzenegger's term. So can you speak a bit more about the importance of addressing issues in the criminal justice system in California and which initiatives you find most promising?
Well, first of all, to give a little history, California from 1919 to 1977 had something called the indeterminate sentence. When you were convicted of a felony and you were going to be sent to prison, you were sent to the term prescribed by law. And the most serious sentence was 7 years to life. Often they had other sentences, 1 to 10 or 5 to life. That was first-degree robbery. First-degree murder was 7 to life. And then when you went to prison, you did not have a term when you would be released. It was uncertain. It was indeterminate. And the parole board would review your behavior in prison, and when the parole board felt you were rehabilitated, they would then give you a term, and so long as you didn't break any rules, you were then released. And the average for murder, just taking that, first-degree murder, the average time spent in prison was around 11 years. Fast forward to the recent decade, the average time is 50 years. The number of prisons we had up to the time George Tukmajian came in, we had 12 prisons. We have now 35 prisons. The number of people in prison fluctuated between 20,000 and 30,000. Over time, beginning in the 80s and the 90s and the first part of this century, the prison system exploded, and it went well over 500%. And that's where you have. Now, if you ask, did the population do that? The answer is no. population went from maybe 24 million to 40 million. The number of felonies, if you look at number of violent felonies, the rate is very similar today as it was in 1970. So something else is going on. And like everything else, you have an action, you have a reaction. So up until about 7 years ago, everything was more sentencing. By the way, in that effort, California now has 5,000 separate criminal provisions. So if you compare that, let's compare that to the 10 Commandments. The key to the 10 Commandments is they're 10. Been 10 since, well, for a long time, right? Well, our criminal code is completely unstable and is growing all the time. Because every time there's a crime, then legislature introduces a new bill, gives it a name, and we get a new crime and a new punishment. And so now we have 5,000 of these crimes, we have all these enhancements, and it becomes extremely complex. One of the most frequent errors that judges make is in the sentence. They give the defendant, when convicted, a sentence that the law does not provide. And the reason they do that is that the law is so damn complicated that even the judges can't figure it out. And that's why now, every month, the state has to send letters to various courts because we have a group of people who just spend all their time looking at the facts of the case and the sentencing, and where there's an error, we send it back and say, would you take a look, you've miscalculated here. So this is another product of the modern society. Things get very complicated, and we've gone from a totally discretionary system, ruled depending on the parole board, to wanting to prescribe in minute detail what shall be the outcome. If you do this crime, and remember you got 5,000 crimes, then you will have this punishment with these enhancements, and you will have these credits for good time or rehabilitation, and those are spelled out very precisely. So it's an incredibly complex system that very few people know about. I mean, if there are 30 deputy DAs that can understand it, I'm sure none of them understand it totally. It defies human understanding. So that's the system, and we've been trying to ameliorate it over time. Now, I think there's a larger point here. How was it that for 60 years, the people of California would trust an unelected parole board to determine whether someone stays in prison 7 years or 45 years? I've just had a case last week. He was sent under the old law, 7 to life. Well, he was still in 42 years. So they trusted the parole board. Pretty soon, though, it happened that people didn't trust the parole board anymore, and they just said, no, we got to make it specific, and we have to prescribe. So we went to determinate sentencing, and went to determinate sentencing. Anytime you say, if you commit this crime, we're going to get 5 years, but then say, oh, no, that's a bad crime. No, let's give them 10, 15, 20. It never stops. So like on the first degree murder, it used to be 7 to life. Then it was changed to 25 to life. Then it was changed, if you use a gun as opposed to a knife, then you get another 25 years, so that makes it 50. If you're in a gang, you get another 10, that makes it 60. And then you used to be able to get day-for-day credit if you behaved in prison. Then they said, no, that's not right. They took it down to a third, then they took it down to 15%, then they took it down to 0 if it was a violent crime. So all this stuff is changing and churning, and that's the system that I found. And so that's why we've increased the number of paroles, made youthful offenders be able to get out earlier, elderly offenders be able to get eligible for parole. So the big change is that parole is playing a bigger role. We're bringing more discretion into the system. But that's something that the courts feel very uncomfortable with, letting a group of people, however well-intentioned, have wide discretion. And this is the constant tension. The legislature wants to prescribe everything, and the governor wants to have the flexibility to decide. Like I like to say, I want unconstrained, unfettered authority to do what I want. That's the ideal dictatorship. So we constrain it, but how much do you constrain it? And it's that balance. And it's either too hobbling of the executive, or the executive gets out of control. And that's kind of the tension that you see federally and you see it locally.
So one of the recent changes, you mentioned parole. One of the recent bills that came into law was relating to bail this summer, eliminating money bail in California. And one aspect of the new law is that would get rid of the bail schedule completely. And for part of the individuals under consideration would be evaluated by people, but part of the people who are evaluated, whether they'll remain in jail or not, will be evaluated by an algorithm that will evaluate certain predictors for these individuals. So this is a fairly large step forward in including algorithms into policymaking and into the criminal justice system. So I wanted to ask you, because we're here at Stanford, which areas of government do you think that algorithmic policymaking like this has the greatest potential for impact? And what do you think are the largest challenges to using algorithms in policymaking?
Well, first of all, I think algorithm, I'm not sure I even know what an algorithm is. But if you think of your medical care, they'll say, okay, you got a 30% chance of this. If you take this, you have this side effect possibility. We're always looking to the past to see what the records show, what's the big data. And because of the advance of computational capacity and storage, we're getting more and more data. So without using this fancy word algorithm, the judges, and we have this for parole too. Let's just take on the parole now. So they will have looked at all the people who've been arrested and all the people who've been released, and how do they do? So yes, they will ask, if you are a certain age, and this gets a little problematic, a certain race. I don't think they put race into it, but if you fit certain characteristics, then we know, if we look at the data, that people who have those characteristics have this propensity to jump bail. So then the judge will look at that, and he can make his own judgment, but there will be evidentiary bases that can be relied upon. Some people think this is going to be discriminatory. I don't think it's been developed yet, and that's something I would work very hard to prevent. But when the legislature got rid of cash bail, there's always the fear that somebody is released on bail, and then he goes and kills somebody. And, oh, you voted for the bill, now it's your fault. So people want the comfort of a little more science, a little more information. And that's what these studies in these records that will be presented to the judge. And so how that all works, to tell you the truth, I haven't read it all. So there it is. It's still, I think, under development. And something we can look at. But we do use we use information that can't specify 100% what the truth is, but it does give us a good understanding. And so that is a better alternative than just using cash. And therefore, if you have the money, if you're a big-time drug dealer, you can get your $500,000, get your bail. But if you're a poor person and you don't have that, then you stay in jail. Could be for a year, pending trial. So this is a compromise. The left, the ACLU, they think it's going to lead to prejudicial results. But the current system is totally prejudiced based on the availability of money. So I would say this is a step forward. The Chief Justice thinks it's a step forward. The legislature thought it was. But I have to say, anytime you're letting people out of jail before trial, it makes people nervous. So they do want some guidance. And that's what I would say these algorithms are. But I'll check them out before I leave.
All right, great. All right, I'm just going to add.
Kind of set in motion. I think there'll be a review process. And I think the important point is that the local judge always has discretion to override.
I saw that. So I just want to ask two more questions because I see we're getting a flow of questions in from the audience. So another one of the ways that California has really led the United States has been in its response to climate change, particularly after the U.S. withdrew from the Paris Agreement last year. And one of those significant ways that California responded was in announcing the Under 2 Coalition, which I know you've been involved with, which is a climate agreement for subnational governments committed to keeping global temperature rises to well below 2 degrees Celsius. So what do you think has been the impact of this initiative so far, and how much change do you think is possible without the recognition of national agencies in climate change?
Well, if there's enough enthusiasm, we can make quite a lot of change at the subnational level. That's cities and states and provinces and regions, and also corporations and universities. There's a lot of initiative now being taken from many, many quarters. So that the Under 2 Coalition is a group of more than 200 states and provinces throughout the world, representing about 25% of the world's population, that is committed to take policies that will keep the climate under 2 degrees. Now, those states and provinces can't do that on their own, but they are taking action. If everybody else did that, we would stay with under 2 degrees. Do we need the federal government? Yes. The federal government, if we compare the federal government in China and the investments they're making in battery technology, what they did in solar energy to dominate the market, the goals they have in high-speed, high voltage lines and high-speed rail and all the rest of it, the national government is an engine. It's the way the people act in common for these greater, longer-term challenges and projects. So, yeah, it's very important that the current the current climate denial in Congress and the White House be changed. We will keep the flame burning, if I could use that as the metaphor here, for stopping climate damage. But that's a mixed metaphor. So there's a lot we need to do. I think we have to keep the enthusiasm. We did a big conference in San Francisco, a climate action conference, brought people together from all over the world. So we have to keep the level of knowledge and concern and commitment constantly building. That's what we're doing. Now, is it enough? No. And if I look around at some of the nations, whether it's Australia that is now backsliding on Paris, whether it's certain countries in Europe, even countries in our hemisphere, we're not doing what we have to do. And every day, just this morning, before I left to come over here, I read an article from the BBC about the temperatures in Great Britain and how this last decade, there's many more hot days, there's fewer cool days, and they go back to 1960 and they measure this. And in the last year, the temperature was higher. And they said that the climate change is definitely a contributor to this. So the evidence every day keeps coming in, and yet the political community, at least as now constituted, is reluctant to take action. And the action we have to take is far beyond where we are. We've got to transform the entire transportation system, the energy system, the manufacturing system. It's huge. And we talk about one day, President Roosevelt said we're not going to have any more private automobiles made. We're going to make tanks and Liberty ships and airplanes. And we did. Well, we're going to have electric cars or hydrogen cars, buses, trucks. We got the different kind of fuels. And that, the government pushes that. That stimulates invention and creativity. But we don't have that. California, Stanford, UC, is doing a lot. And we'll continue to do a lot. But we do need Washington. We need the Congress. We need the president to alert the people and lead us with the kind of investments and rules that are needed to get the job done.
All right, so I wanted to end on a positive note. I want to return to the annihilation and destruction that you brought up in your opening remarks. So after decades of serving the state of California, you've announced that your next role will be as the executive chairman of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, a nonprofit that combats the risks of nuclear war and other existential threats to the world. So can you speak a little bit more about your decision to take on this role and what threats you're most concerned about? And, well, in other words, what do you think Stanford students should be losing sleep over?
Well, I think you should lose some sleep. And while you're losing sleep, go read and understand what's going on. The Bulletin of Atomic Science is a venerable organization. Its original board included Niels Bohr and Albert Einstein. So the fact that with very little science training, I could become the executive chairman, I couldn't not do that. But these big issues are really hard to grapple with. I have a summary way to explain that. Talking about news. You know, politicians are always interested in news and news about them. And what I like to say is, the end of the world is not news. A presidential tweet is news. So to deal with a big issue like changing in the climate, like potential disease or bio-error or bioterror or the nuclear danger, these things are so big that if you tell people honestly what it is, they can't think about it. It's almost, you're being too negative. You just, in fact, I go around my office telling people, boy, it's bad, it's really bad. And so my chief of staff at the time said, you better check with people. You've been talking to Bill Perry too much. So I called another general, I won't tell you what his name, and I said, General, there's this problem. We could have an accidental nuclear war, terrorists could hold nuclear materials, India and Pakistan could get engaged. This is concerning. So don't worry, nuclear materials are completely secured. Russia's deterred. The Pakistani military has good control on their nuclear weapon system. I'm not worried about the Indians, not worried. So I called Bill, I said, Bill, this general's not worried. And Bill Perry said, Perry's worried. So should we all, not to be paralyzed, but to hold our officials accountable and to understand what the state of the world is and what is the path forward. And it's very hard to generate political will, political enthusiasm over such catastrophic topics. But there they are, and I like to frame it in the way that humankind is creating massive new powers, not just algorithms, but new technologies of enormous potential impact for good, but also for ultimate annihilation if not handled properly. So we have to have the wisdom and the knowledge and the restraint to handle ever increasingly destructive machines and technology. So that's the big challenge. And universities are all about understanding those questions. So not only make the new machines, but we have to find ways to introduce into the human dimension, the political, the religious, the cultural, the academic, the kinds of thinking, the kinds of discussions that would steer our own country and hopefully working with other countries in a direction that is truly sustainable. So we use sustainable, but there are a lot of ways we can be totally unsustainable. And I think we have to understand that. And these big questions are there. And I hope as a part of the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, and I'm also on the Nuclear Threat Initiative, I can do something. I like to deal with the big stuff. We deal with a lot of little things, but I think the end of the world is the biggest thing I can think of to avoid, okay? So working on that, and it's very challenging figuring out how to take this topic and break it down in a way that it can be communicated, can be talked about, and can be dealt with by people. And so that's why it interests me, because of all the challenges that I've had to face in my life or in my career as a public official, this is the biggest of these set of potential catastrophic outcomes. That, how to get your hands around that, who are the people that have to be most alerted, and how do we deal with it? And I can tell you, in the political domain, it's not on the agenda as yet. Climate change is a little bit on the agenda, more in California than in Washington. So there's a lot to do, and students and professors, there's a lot for you to teach because we're not out of the woods yet, not by a long shot.
All right. Okay, so we have some audience questions now. Let's see. Okay, this is a good one. This was a question I actually was planning on asking. So we have a question, I assume for a student. What advice do you have for students hoping to enter government and politics in this age of 2018?
Well, there are a lot of intern programs at the state level. I think you ought to try to, those are worth looking into, fellowships. You got to start somewhere. And so I think that's good. And I think studying economics, political science, contemporary history, those are the things that you need. And then you see opportunities. You work, it's amazing. Campaigns are very open. And my wife, who was an executive at the Gap and is very organized, quite a manager. And I said, when we started my campaign, I said, don't worry, people will just show up. And actually, people walk in. You start a campaign office, and all of a sudden, dozens of people start showing up. And you find you find a lot of good people that way. And a lot of people worked in my campaign and came to work in the governor's office. In fact, some of them became judges. If you're a lawyer, it's a good thing to do, work in a governor's campaign. So I campaigned, entering campaigns is a good thing. Trying to get in with political offices or maybe nonprofit or other places, like even industry, where they have government affairs representatives. That's another way in. But everybody gets into politics or government differently.
So another question, kind of relating to some of the topics this morning. You've done a lot of work in your time as governor, working on balanced budgets for California. We have a surplus. So this question is, what is your advice for the next governor of California with regard to the budget and personal income taxes and spending? Tough question.
I'd say don't be too exuberant and get everybody ready because the economy does go, the business cycle is a cycle. And it has a peak and it has a valley. Right now, we're at the peak, but you can't be at the peak forever. So you have to prepare. We have a rainy day fund, but you also have to keep a restraint on the tempo of new initiatives. And I can say that there is a very powerful appetite for more intervention and more stuff for government to do. But when you think of how big and complicated even the state government is, state government of California, I was talking to my person who works with me, the chief of staff. She used to be the head of the health department. We were talking about how complex the California Health Department is. And I was comparing that to how complex the prison system is, with 35 prisons. So the state of affairs, what I would say is be careful about, and I am rather skeptical of new bills. I mean, since I've been governor, I've dealt with 16,000 bills. I've signed 92% of them. So that's and every bill, not every bill, but a lot of them have spawned several regulations. And if you think of those as commands from the bunker of Sacramento, and we're sending commands to people, do this, but don't do that. And those prescriptions are ever more minute and invasive. So how many of those can we have and keep a dynamic, fluid, flexible, open society? I think that's what I'd be wary of. So I know if it's the first time you saw something, that gives you one impression. But when you've seen thousands of bills for decades keep coming and doing the same thing, and a lot of these problems, they always say, some people run for office, they say they're a problem solver. Well, if that were true, why aren't the problems solved? They're not. These are conditions we deal with. crime and punishment, taxes, roads, all this. You're constantly dealing with problems, but you want to deal with them in a way that you don't even create more problems. And I've learned kind of a secret truth here that I'll reveal to you, that government can best solve the problems that it first creates. Yeah, if we create a problem by passing a stupid bill, we can amend the bill. A real problem, like all the people for government are going around and say, affordabilities, we got to make it more affordable. We're going to lower the price of housing, we're going to lower the price of this. Very difficult to just modify the macro economy by some form of legislation. Most of the time you're going to probably screw it up. So I'd say be generous, be open, but take a careful eye, because there's no limit to ideas that people want and they want to impose. I just give you one I wanted to mention. I forgot to bring it up. On the criminal area, there have been, since I was governor the first time, since 1978, 21 separate initiatives changing the criminal law. Most of them to make it more draconian and increasing penalty. So that's 21 times, and we have another one on the ballot in 2020. So there's a lot of churning going on, and we have the legislators. You got the Republicans and their ideas, the Democrats got their ideas, we got the Senate, we got the Assembly. By the way, the Assembly, you'll probably be glad to know, used to have a limit of 20 bills per legislator. They doubled that, so now they have 40 bills. So now when you think of that, 120 people, say an average of 20 bills, some of those bills can go 50 pages. How many people know how much of what's in those bills? And the answer is, I won't answer that question. But I can tell you, when they get down to my desk, I only get a fraction of the bills, like about 1,000 become law. And then I got to look at it. I have a team. I have a team of a lot of well-trained people who spend all their time just reading those bills and helping me handle them. And that's all I can do is to understand them. So when you pass them through the legislature, it's almost impossible to understand a number of the bills. So things are moving, and I would say to the people who are running now, look through things. You got plenty of time. There's always another legislative session. Don't worry. Doesn't have to happen this year. And because you find out, well, I'm the only governor who actually created problems by bills that I signed, and now I was able to undo them 35 years later. So I'm very clear on how you can do things that sound pretty good, but are actually stupid, and you don't find that out until it's too late. Well, in my case, I get to correct it. I have one of the things I corrected. I'm the one who signed the bill to abolish the indeterminate sentence and replace it with the fixed sentence. And I didn't understand that once you take from a parole board of experts and you turn it over to the legislature to make the crime bills, they never get enough. And every year you have dozens of more increasing penalties, and that's exactly what happened. So I'm trying to return it now to give the parole board more discretion. So I could give you a number of examples. So that's why I would say to the next governor, take time, get well-seasoned people. And when I first started, I was 36, I thought experience was bunk. Now I say there is no substitute for experience.
So I guess for our last question, sort of on that similar topic, is that there are people, the student makes a point that there are people who are good at campaigning, but being good at campaigning doesn't always translate to being good at governing. And you've certainly had a lot of experience at governing and a lot of successes in your career. So what do you think are the characteristics of good governance? What does it mean to govern well over people?
I think they are different than campaigning. I want to enumerate all the dark arts that campaigning requires. For governing, first of all, you got to listen. You have to listen. You have to start with the assumption that you don't know all there is to know, that there's more to be said. Because in government, most of what information you get is from advocates. And I like to divide the world into advocacy and inquiry. And most of the people I see, at least coming up with ideas, they're advocating. And advocates are making an argument. They're not trying to present an inquiry into what are all the circumstances and consequences of whatever's being proposed. So I think that piercing the veil of overstated advocacy is very important. Secondly, I think you have to have, well, this is another aspect of that. To have people in government, you need people who can manage things. Most of what you hear is the noise of advocacy. And the noisier, the more you hear about it. But when you have to manage something, that's a quieter, more deliberative process. So it is different. So you need a lot of managers. You need people who can make the trains run on time. But you also need creative ideas so that you can have a government that is fruitful and is open in making new things be part of the equation. So I don't know if there's any formula. If you have too much experience, then you're too cautious. If you're young and bold, you're probably going to make a lot of mistakes. So I'm not quite sure which is better. You need boldness and you need caution. I like to think of Ecclesiastes. There's a time to build, there's a time to destroy. There's a time for war, and there's a time for peace. So if you just read Ecclesiastes, I think you'll have some good guidance on how to proceed.
All right. I think that might be all the time that we have for questions, because we know we have a next session starting at 1. But I just wanted to thank you so much, Governor Brown, for coming to speak, and it's been wonderful having you. So let's give a round of applause.
Thank you.